A pregnant Hopi widow was digging a well with her bare hands in the scorching Arizona desert, until a mysterious rancher appeared with an offer that would change both their lives forever. The sun hung like a copper coin against the bleached sky, casting no mercy on the red earth below. Dust devils danced across the mesa, and the only sound for miles was the rhythmic scraping of metal against stone. In this forgotten corner of the Arizona territory, where the Hopi reservation met the endless expanse of cattle country, desperation wore the face of a 23-year-old woman whose hands had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. Nayeli Yazzie knelt beside a hole that had consumed 3 weeks of her life, a pit barely 4 feet deep that mocked her efforts with each swing of the rusted pickaxe. Her belly, 7 months swollen with child, pressed against her knees as she worked.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Sweat carved clean lines through the dust on her face, and her black hair, once braided with the care her grandmother had taught her, now hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. The reservation well had run dry 2 months ago, and the government's promises meant less than smoke in the wind. She paused to wipe her brow, leaving a streak of mud across her temple. The baby kicked, hard enough to steal her breath. "I know, little one," she whispered in Hopi, placing a protective hand over her belly. "Mama's trying." The child's father, her husband Kiva, would have known where to dig. He understood the language of water the way she understood the patterns in her grandmother's pottery. But Kiva had been dead 4 months now, taken by the fever that swept through the reservation like wildfire, leaving behind a widow and an unborn child who needed water more than they needed sympathy. The trading post charged $1 for a barrel of water, money she didn't have and credit they wouldn't extend to, just another squaw, as the clerk so kindly put it. So here she was, 7 miles from the nearest settlement, digging into earth that seemed determined to reject her offering of blood and sweat. Her grandmother would have said the earth spirits were angry, that she needed to make proper offerings before disturbing the ground. But proper offerings required resources she no longer possessed, and desperation had a way of making philosophers out of even the most faithful. Nayeli gripped the pickaxe again, its wooden handle worn smooth by her desperate hands. Each strike sent vibrations up her arms, jarring her teeth and making her spine ache. The earth here was different from the soil near her grandmother's home, harder, more resistant, as if it bore grudges against those who dared disturb its surface. She'd started this excavation with hope burning bright in her chest, fueled by stories Kiva had told about finding water in unlikely places. Now 3 weeks later, that hope had dimmed to barely glowing embers. The hole grew wider but not deeper, the walls crumbling faster than she could reinforce them. She needed timber for supports, rope for buckets, tools that didn't fight her every move. Most of all, she needed knowledge, the kind that came from years of experience reading the land's secrets. Her husband had possessed that knowledge, learned from his grandfather who'd been a water finder for the tribe. But that wisdom had died with him, leaving Nayeli to stumble forward with nothing but determination and increasingly bloody hands. A coyote's howl echoed across the mesa, answered by another from the opposite direction. The sound made her shiver despite the heat. Coyotes were tricksters in the old stories, creatures that led people astray for their own amusement. Sometimes, she wondered if one hadn't whispered this location to her in a dream, knowing she'd exhaust herself chasing phantom water. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the desert silence. Nayeli's hands stilled on the pickaxe handle, her heart hammering against her ribs. Strangers out here meant trouble more often than help. She'd learned that lesson the hard way when the cattle baron's men came around asking questions about water rights and making veiled threats about trespassers on open range. The reservation boundaries were fluid things when it came to white men's claims, shifting like sand whenever it suited their purposes. The rider quested the small rise to her, East, his silhouette dark against the burning sky. He rode alone, which was either very good or very bad. In this territory, a man traveling solo was either supremely confident in his abilities or supremely desperate. Nayeli hoped it wasn't the latter. Desperate men did desperate things, and a pregnant Indian woman miles from help made an easy target. For someone with ill intentions, as he drew closer, she could make out details that didn't quite fit together. His horse was quality stock bay gelding that moved like it had Arabian blood mixed with Mustang endurance. The animal's coat gleamed with good care, and its tack was well-maintained leather that spoke of someone who understood the value of proper equipment. But the rider's clothes were work-worn rather than fancy, and his posture suggested someone more comfortable on horseback than in drawing rooms. When he was close enough for conversation, he reined in his mount and sat silent. For a long moment, studying her makeshift excavation. His hat was pulled low against the sun, casting his face in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze as he took in the scene, the pathetic hole, her sweat-stained clothes, the obvious desperation of her situation. Most men would have made some comment by now, offered advice or criticism in equal measure. His silence was somehow more unsettling than words would have been. "That's a hell of a job for a woman in your condition," he said finally, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who'd spent years under open sky. There was no mockery in the words, no condescension, just observation delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. Nayeli straightened, one hand resting on her belly, the other still gripping the pickaxe. The tool felt reassuringly solid in her grip, not much use as a weapon, but better than nothing if this encounter turned ugly. "Didn't ask for your opinion," she replied, meeting his shadowed gaze without flinching. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness invited worse treatment than showing defiance. Men respected strength even when they didn't like it. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with the lean build of a working rancher rather than the soft flesh of a town dweller. His movements carried the unconscious confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, at ease in a landscape that would break softer men. When he pushed back his hat, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with gray eyes that seemed older than his 30-something years. A scar ran along his left jaw, faded white against tan skin. It looked old, the kind of mark left by a knife rather than an accident. Combined with the calluses on his hands and the way he carried himself, it painted a picture of someone who'd lived a harder life than his quality horse and gear might suggest. There were stories written in those scars, tales of violence survived and lessons learned the hard way. "Name's Cole Travers," he said, approaching the edge of her excavation with careful steps. His boots were worn but well made, and he placed them with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned not to trust uncertain ground. "And you're digging in the wrong place." Heat flared in Nayeli's chest, not from the sun, but from anger. Here it was, the inevitable moment when the white man arrived to explain how she was doing everything wrong. Never mind that she'd been working this ground for 3 weeks, bleeding into it, pouring her desperation into every strike of the pickaxe. Apparently all it took was one look from Cole Travers to reveal her foolishness. White man shows up and suddenly knows better than the woman who's been working this ground for 3 weeks? "How convenient," she snapped, her voice sharp with accumulated frustration. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, men who assumed her ignorance based on her gender and heritage, who believed their casual observations trumped her hard-won experience. Cole held up a hand, palm out in a gesture of peace. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind used to calm spooked horses or skittish cattle. "Easy now. I'm not trying to insult you, but I've been ranching this territory for 15 years, and I know where the water runs." He gestured toward her hole with a tilt of his chin. "You're fighting hard pan here. Nothing but clay and caliche for 30 feet down."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
But if you go about 50 yards that way, he pointed toward a slight depression in the land that she'd dismissed as unimportant. You'll hit the water table at maybe 8 feet. Nayeli studied his face, looking for the smirk or condescension she'd grown accustomed to from white men. Instead, she found something unexpected, genuine concern mixed with what looked like professional competence. His eyes held the steady gaze of someone who knew his business, who'd made enough mistakes to recognize them in others. There was no mockery there, no superiority, just information offered without judgment. "And why would you tell me this?" she asked, suspicion warring with hope in her voice. Nothing in her experience suggested that white men helped Indian women out of simple kindness. There was always an angle, always a price to be paid later when the debt came due. "Because I've got eyes," Cole replied simply. "I can see you need water, and I can see you're willing to work yourself into the ground to get it. Admire that kind of determination." He paused, his gaze shifting to her swollen belly. "Besides, looks like you're working for two." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly sharp kick, doubling Nayeli over with a gasp. The child had been restless all day, as if sensing its mother's desperation and adding its own protest to the situation. Cole stepped forward instinctively, one hand extended as if to steady her, but stopped when she held up a warning hand. The gesture spoke of someone accustomed to helping, but respectful enough to wait for permission. "I'm fine," she managed through gritted teeth, though even as she said it, she felt the lie in her bones. She wasn't fine. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of time. The baby was due in 2 months, and without water, neither of them would survive to see the birth. Her body was already showing signs of strained, swollen feet, constant headaches, a bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't touch. Cole watched her struggle with something that looked like recognition in his eyes, as if he'd seen this particular brand of desperation before. "When's the last time you had a proper drink?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested the question came from experience rather than casual concern. "That's not your concern," Nayeli replied automatically, but the words lacked conviction. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had enough water to feel truly satisfied rather than just functional. The canteen at her side held barely 2 swallows, rationed out to last until she could make the long trek to the trading post. "It is if you're planning to keep digging. Dead woman can't dig wells." The bluntness of the statement cut through her defenses like a blade. Cole walked back to his horse and returned with a canteen, offering it without comment. The gesture was simple, practical, but it carried weight. In this land where water meant life, pride warred with thirst in Nayeli's chest. She wanted to refuse, to maintain the independence that was all she had left. But the baby kicked again, and she could feel the child's need in her own parched throat. The canteen was military issue. She noticed worn leather and dented metal that spoke of long campaigns and hard use. She took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, the water tasting like salvation. It was clean, cool, and abundant enough that she didn't have to ration every swallow. "Thank you," she said quietly, handing it back. The simple courtesy felt strange on her tongue. It had been too long since she'd had reason to thank anyone for genuine kindness. Cole secured the canteen to his belt and looked around at her meager camp with professional assessment. She followed his gaze, seeing it through fresh eyes, the threadbare blanket spread under a makeshift lean-to, a small fire ring with barely enough kindling for one more meal, and the tools that spoke of someone making do with whatever they could find or afford. The inventory of her desperation laid out for a stranger's inspection. "You got family on the reservation?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. They're gone now." Nayeli's voice carried the weight of losses too heavy for her years. Fever took most of them last winter. The rest, she shrugged, a gesture that encompassed abandonment, prejudice, and the casual cruelty of people who saw her mixed blood as belonging nowhere. Her grandmother's death had severed her last real connection to the tribe, and her marriage to Kiva had been brief enough that his relatives felt no obligation to a widow they'd never fully accepted. Cole nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. There was understanding in his expression, the kind that came from personal familiarity with loss. "And the child's father?" he asked gently. "Dead." The word came out flat and final. She'd learned not to elaborate on Kiva's death, not to mention how the reservation doctor had been too busy to see him until it was too late, or how the medicine that might have saved him was reserved for more deserving patients at the white settlement. The anger that accompanied those memories was too large for words, too dangerous to let loose in front of a stranger. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind across stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Cole seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision, his hands flexing and relaxing at his sides. There was something in his posture that suggested a man standing at a crossroads, weighing options with the care of someone who'd learned that choices had consequences. "I've got a proposition for you," he said finally, the words coming out like he'd been rehearsing them. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. She'd heard propositions before from white men who saw a young Indian woman and thought they knew what she was good for. The offers usually involved companionship in exchange for temporary shelter, arrangements that left women worse off than when they started. "I'm not that kind of woman," she said sharply. "It's not that kind of proposition." Cole's voice carried a sharp edge that suggested he'd encountered assumptions about his character before and didn't appreciate them. "I'm talking about water. Real water. A working well with a windmill pump." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And a cabin that's sitting empty, going to waste while you're out here fighting the desert." Despite herself, Nayeli felt hope stir in her chest like a candle flame in darkness. Real water, not rationed drops or expensive barrels, but actual abundance. A cabin meant walls against the wind, a roof against the rain, safety for when the baby came. It sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. "What's the catch?" she asked, because there was always a catch. Nothing in this life came without a price, and she'd learned to be suspicious of generosity that seemed to expect nothing in return. "No catch, just an offer." Cole gestured toward the mesa rising behind them, purple in the afternoon light. "I own a spread about 10 miles north of here. Good well, reliable water, and a cabin that's sitting empty. You could stay there until the baby comes. After that ... He shrugged. "We'll figure something out." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Nayeli's first instinct was suspicion. "Why would you do that?" she demanded. "You don't even know me." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to turn. And I know what it's like to watch someone die because help came too late." There was pain in those words, old and carefully hidden, but real enough that Nayeli recognized it. She'd carried the same kind of hurt since Kiva's death, the hollow ache of being alone in a world that seemed determined to grind you down. Whatever had put that look in Cole Travers' eyes, it had left marks as deep as any physical scar. "And what would you want in return?" she asked, because nothing in her experience came without a price. Even kindness had its cost, paid an obligation, or expectation or simple human debt. "Nothing," Cole said, and the simplicity of the word was more shocking than any elaborate explanation would have been. "Maybe some cooking if you're so inclined, but that's between you and your conscience. I spend most of my time on the range anyway, checking fences and moving cattle. You'd have the place mostly to yourself." Nayeli stared at him, trying to reconcile this offer with everything she'd learned about trusting strangers. "You don't even know my name," she pointed out, Nayeli Yazzie, Cole said quietly. Kiva's wife. He used to work roundup for some of the smaller ranchers before he got sick. Good man. Honest worker. Talked about his wife and the baby coming. Like they were the center of his universe. The fact that he'd known her husband, had respected him enough to remember his name, shifted something in Nayeli's chest. Kiva had always been a good judge of character, able to see through surface appearances to the truth underneath. If this man had earned her husband's trust, if Kiva had spoken of his family to him, "You knew Kiva," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. Not well, but enough to know he was the kind of man who'd move heaven and earth for his family. Seems to me he'd want someone to look after his wife and child if he couldn't do it himself. Cole's voice was gentle, respectful of her grief without trying to minimize it. Tears stung Nayeli's eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She couldn't afford to cry, couldn't afford to be weak, but Cole's words cut straight through her. Defenses to the grief she'd been carrying alone for months. Kiva would have wanted this for her, would have swallowed his pride and accepted help if it meant their child had a chance of life. The wind picked up, sending dust devils skittering across the excavation site. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Soon it would be dark, and Nayeli would spend another night huddled under her inadequate shelter, listening to coyotes howl in the distance and feeling her unborn child move restlessly in her womb. "I don't accept charity," she said finally. The words carrying the weight of pride that was all she had left. "Good thing I'm not offering charity." Cole's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm offering partnership. You need water and shelter. I need someone to keep an eye on the property when I'm out with the herd. Place has been sitting empty too long gets to looking abandoned, invites the wrong kind of attention. Seems like we might be able to help each other." Partnership. The word resonated in ways that charity never could. It implied equality, mutual benefit, respect. It suggested that she had something to offer besides just need, that her presence would be valued rather than merely tolerated. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Cole shrugged, the movement casual but his eyes serious. "Then I ride away and you keep digging." "Your choice, but if you change your mind, offer stands." At least until the snows come. The baby kicked again, harder. This time as if offering its own opinion on the matter. Nayeli placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life stirring within her life that needed water, shelter, and hope if it was going to survive in this harsh world. Her child deserved better than a mother's stubborn pride. She looked at her pathetic excavation, at the tools that were failing her, at the empty horizon that stretched endlessly in all directions. Then she looked at Cole Travers, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere with an offer that seemed too good to be true. But sometimes miracles wore the faces of unlikely angels. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "and this turns out to be some kind of trap, then you'll do what you have to do to protect yourself and your child." Cole finished. "I wouldn't expect anything less, but it's not a trap, Nayeli. It's just a chance." There was something in his tone, a recognition of her strength rather than her vulnerability, that decided the matter. Nayeli had been making hard choices all her life, but rarely had one of them offered even the possibility of hope. And sometimes hope was worth the risk. "All right," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'll come with you," Cole nodded once, a sharp movement that suggested relief rather than triumph. "Good. Let's get your things together. It'll be dark soon, and the trail's easier to follow in daylight." He moved with practiced efficiency, gathering her meager possessions without comment or judgment. The pickaxe went across his saddle horn, her cooking pot and few utensils into his saddlebags. When he reached for her threadbare blanket, she stopped him. "I can carry that," Nayeli said, folding the worn fabric with care. It had been her grandmother's, woven in the old style with patterns that told stories of rain and growing corn. The blanket smelled of smoke and memories, but it was all she had left of the woman who'd raised her after her mother's death. Some things were too precious to trust to strangers, no matter how kind they seemed. Cole watched her careful handling of the blanket, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, perhaps a recognition of the way people clung to fragments of their past. "My horse can carry double for a while," he said, "but we'll need to go slow. Trail gets rough in places." Nayeli looked at his bay gelding, a magnificent animal that stood 16 hands if it stood an inch. The horse was clearly built for endurance rather than speed, with the kind of intelligent eyes that spoke of careful breeding and patient training. Still, adding her weight to the saddle would be asking a lot, especially given her condition. You sure he can manage?" she asked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby had been particularly active all day, as if sensing the momentous changes occurring in its world. Rangers carried heavier loads over longer distances, Cole replied, running a gentle hand along the horse's neck. The animal turned its head toward him with obvious affection, the kind of bond that developed between man and horse through years of mutual dependence. He's Mustang stock crossed with Morgan. Built for this country, the complement to his horses. Bloodline was delivered with the quiet pride of someone who understood good horseflesh. Nayeli could see why he'd be confident in the animal's abilities. Ranger had the deep chest and strong hindquarters that marked him as a horse bred for mountain trails and desert crossings. Cole helped her mount, his hands respectful but firm, as he steadied her climb into the saddle. The baby protested the new position with a series of sharp kicks that made her gasp. "Easy there, little warrior," she murmured in Hopi, placing both hands on her belly until the movement settled. "Warrior. Is it?" Cole asked as he swung up behind her. His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than the polite interest she'd grown accustomed to from whites who thought Indian customs were quaint at best. "The way this one fights, it has to be," Nayeli replied, surprised to find herself smiling. Shiva used to say the baby was practicing for the world outside, learning to be strong before the real battles began. Cole's arms came around her to take the reins, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of his presence. "Sounds like a wise man," he said quietly. "Children who fight early usually grow up to be survivors." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with the subject, but Nayeli didn't press. Everyone in this territory had stories of loss and survival, tales of fighting for life in a land that seemed determined to test every soul it touched. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of Ranger's movement beneath them, the steady 4-beat gait that ate up ground without jarring her over much. They climbed gradually, away from her failed excavation, following a trail that wasn't quite a trail, more like a suggestion written in stone and sparse vegetation. Cole guided Ranger with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, reading the landscape with the expertise of someone who'd spent years learning its moods and dangers. The horse responded to his guidance with the kind of trust that spoke of countless miles traveled together. "How long have you had him?" Nayeli asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious. The relationship between this man and his horse seemed deeper than simple ownership. "Found him as a yearling, half dead from thirst and fighting a pack of coyotes over a dried-up water hole," Cole replied. "Figured if he had that much fight in him, he deserved a chance. Took 2 years to convince him that humans weren't all bad, but once he decided to trust me, never looked back." The story revealed more about Cole than he'd probably intended. Most men would have put a suffering animal out of its misery rather than invest time and effort in rehabilitation. The fact that he'd seen potential in a half-wild yearling suggested someone with patience and compassion, qualities not always common in frontier ranchers. As they climbed higher, the landscape changed around them. The harsh desert floor gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The air grew cooler, carrying scents of sage and distant rain. Nayeli found herself breathing easier, as if the altitude had lifted some of the oppressive weight that had been crushing her chest for weeks. "Storm coming," Cole observed, nodding toward clouds building on the western horizon. They were still small, but their edges held the dark promise of moisture. "Might get some rain tonight. Good for the grass, but it'll make the trail slick come morning." Nayeli studied the clouds with interest. She'd grown up learning to read weather signs from her grandmother, but desert storms were different from the mountain weather patterns of her childhood. "How can you tell from so far away?" she asked. "Color of the clouds, the way the wind's shifting. See how the horses down in that valley are all facing the same direction? They know what's coming before we do." Cole pointed to a distant group of wild mustangs, barely visible as dark dots against the golden grass. "Animals are better weather predictors than any almanac." His casual expertise impressed her. This wasn't book learning or casual observation. This was the kind of knowledge that came from years of living close to the land, of understanding that survival often depended on reading signs others missed. Kiva had possessed similar skills, though his had been focused on finding water rather than predicting weather. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, Ranger's steady pace covering ground without apparent effort. The horse seemed to know exactly where they were going, requiring minimal guidance from his rider. Nayeli found herself relaxing into the rhythm, her body finally released from the constant tension of the past weeks. "That canyon up ahead," Cole said, breaking into her thoughts, "used to be a hideout for rustlers back in the 70s. Apaches. Before that, when they were still raiding. Good water, defensible position, plenty of grass for horses." "You sound like you know it well," Nayeli observed. "Spent some time there myself, years back, different circumstances." There was something guarded in his voice, a hint of stories he wasn't ready to tell. "Makes a good shelter if you know where to find the entrance." The comment raised questions she wasn't sure she should ask. What circumstances had driven Cole Travers to seek shelter in an abandoned rustler's hideout? The scar on his jaw suggested a violent past, and his obvious familiarity with the territory's hidden places painted a picture of someone who'd needed to disappear from time to time. As they crested a ridge, the view opened up to reveal a valley that took Nayeli's breath away. Below them spread a natural basin perhaps 2 miles across, carpeted in gamma grass and dotted with cottonwoods that marked the course of a meandering stream. At the valley's heart sat a cluster of buildings, a log cabin with a stone chimney, a substantial barn, corrals that spoke of serious horse operation, and the skeletal silhouette of a windmill turning lazily in the evening breeze. "Welcome to the Triple T," Cole said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. "Been building this place for 15 years, piece by piece." The ranch was impressive not for its size, but for its obvious functionality. Every building sat in exactly the right spot to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water flow. The corrals were built with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who truly understood horses. Even from this distance, Nayeli could see that this was a working ranch run by someone who cared about doing things right. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. After weeks in the harsh desert, the valley looked like paradise green and welcoming, with water that actually flowed instead of hiding deep underground. "Gets prettier when you're not dying of thirst," Cole replied with dry humor. "That windmill pulls water from a spring that's never gone dry, not even in the worst drought years. Spring-fed creek runs year-round, though it gets down to a trickle in late summer. Water, real, reliable water." Nayeli felt tears sting her eyes at the thought of abundance after so much scarcity. The baby kicked as if sensing her excitement, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. "Your little warrior approves," she told Cole. The trail down into the valley was steep but well maintained, switching back and forth across the slope to ease the grade. Ranger took it with the confidence of a horse that had made this journey countless times, his hooves finding purchase on rocky sections with sure-footed grace. Cole's hands remained steady on the reins, But Nayeli could feel his attention focused on their surroundings, constantly alert for potential dangers. "Habit," he explained when she commented on his vigilance. "Too many years of watching for trouble to break it now. Besides, a man who lets his guard down usually doesn't get a chance to regret it." As they descended, details of the ranch became clearer. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from above, built of whole logs with careful attention to weatherproofing and insulation. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade in summer and protection from winter winds. The barn was equally impressive, constructed with the kind of heavy timber that spoke of someone planning for the long term. "You built all this yourself?" Nayeli asked, awed by the scope of the undertaking. "Most of it. Had help with the heavy lifting, barn raising and such. But the planning and most of the work, yeah, that was me." Cole's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd literally built his dreams from the ground up. Started with nothing but a bedroll and a claim stake. Took 5 years just to get the cabin livable. The accomplishment was staggering. Building a ranch from scratch in this territory required not just physical strength and skill, but incredible determination and careful planning. The fact that Cole had done it largely alone spoke to a level of self-reliance that bordered on the extraordinary. They reached the valley floor as the sun touched the western rim, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of water and growing things. Nayeli breathed deeply, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in months. Cole helped her down from Ranger's back, his hands gentle but sure as he steadied her descent. The baby protested the change in position with a flurry of movement that made her gasp. "Easy, little one," she murmured, rubbing her belly until the child settled. "Let's get you inside and settled," Cole said, leading Ranger toward the barn. "I'll tend to the horse and then show you around properly." The cabin's interior was a revelation. Nayeli had expected rough frontier accommodations, a single room with basic furniture and minimal comforts. Instead, she found herself in a well-appointed home that spoke of someone who appreciated quality and took pride in his surroundings. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furniture built to last, and windows positioned to take advantage of natural light and cross-ventilation. A kitchen area occupied one corner, complete with a cast-iron stove that looked new and a hand pump that promised running water. Shelves held dishes and cooking implements, while dried herbs hung from the rafters in neat bundles. Everything was clean and well-organized, the home of someone who lived alone but maintained standards. "There's a bedroom through that door," Cole said, returning from the barn. "Made the bed fresh this morning, like I was expecting company." Sometimes a man just knows things are about to change. The comment was casual, but it carried undertones that made Nayeli look at him sharply. "You were expecting me, not you. Specifically. But I've been watching that area where you were digging for weeks, wondering who was fool enough to try digging a well in hardpan. When I finally rode over to investigate ... he shrugged. Let's just say I wasn't entirely surprised to find someone who needed help." The admission raised new questions about Cole Travers and his motivations. Had he been watching her struggle from a distance? If so, why had he waited so long to intervene? The thought of being observed without her knowledge was unsettling, but she pushed the discomfort aside. Whatever his reasons, he was helping her now. Cole prepared supper with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to cooking for himself. The meal was simple, but substantial: beans and salt pork, cornbread baked in a Dutch oven, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. To Nayeli, who'd been subsisting on dwindling supplies for weeks, it tasted like a feast. "You're a good cook," she said, surprised by the quality of the meal. "Man lives alone long enough, he learns to take care of himself or he starves," Cole replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Though I'll admit it's nice to have someone to cook for besides myself." They ate by lamplight, the comfortable silence broken only by the distant sound of cattle lowing and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Nayeli found herself studying her host, trying to reconcile his obvious competence and generosity with the hints of a darker past that surfaced in unguarded moments. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Shoot, why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's just because you knew Kiva. There's more to it than that." Cole set down his coffee cup and stared into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. "Because 5 years ago, I watched someone die who didn't have to. Someone who needed help and didn't get it in time. Someone who might have lived if just one person had been willing to step up and do what was right." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Nayeli waited, sensing that pushing for details would only cause him to retreat behind his walls. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Cole looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "Ancient history now. But it taught me something about the cost of standing aside when you could make a difference." Later, after Cole had shown her the bedroom and retreated to his own space in the loft, Nayeli lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks. The mattress was comfortable, the sheets clean and soft, and the walls solid enough to shut out the night sounds that had kept her wakeful during her weeks in the desert. Yet sleep eluded her. Too much had changed too quickly. This morning she'd been a desperate woman digging a futile hole in unforgiving ground. Tonight she lay in comfort and safety, with reliable water just steps away and a mysterious benefactor who asked for nothing in return. The transformation was so complete it felt like a dream, and she was afraid that closing her eyes might make it all disappear. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, perhaps sensing her anxiety. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered the old songs her grandmother had taught her, lullabies in Hopi that spoke of safe journeys and peaceful sleep. Gradually the child settled, and Nayeli felt her own tension begin to ease. Through the window, she could see stars blazing in the clear desert sky. The same stars that had watched over her desperate digging, that had seemed so cold and distant when she'd had nothing but hope to sustain her. Now they looked different, not cold, but peaceful, keeping their ancient watch over a world where miracles still occasionally happened. From somewhere in the cabin came the sound of Cole moving quietly, checking locks and banking the fire. For the night, the sounds were comforting, domestic, the actions of someone taking responsibility for her safety, as well as his own. When had she last felt protected rather than merely defended? When had she last been able to rely on someone else's strength instead of her own? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about this arrangement and what it might mean for her future. But tonight, for the first time in months, Nayeli Yazzie felt safe. Safe and grateful, and blessed by whatever spirits had guided Cole Travers to her desperate excavation in the desert. Outside, a coyote called across the valley, its voice carrying notes of wildness and freedom. But tonight, the sound held no threat, no reminder of her vulnerability. Tonight it was simply the voice of the desert singing her to sleep. While inside a stranger's cabin, she finally allowed herself to rest. Nayeli woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, aromas so rich and inviting that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Sunlight streamed through windows that actually had glass, a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed. The bed beneath her was soft and warm, a far cry from the hard ground she'd grown accustomed to during her weeks in the desert. For several heartbeats, she lay still, afraid that moving would shatter this illusion of comfort and safety. The baby stirred within her, stretching against the walls of her womb with what felt like contentment. Even her unborn child seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, moving with less of the restless urgency that had marked recent weeks. Nayeli placed her hands on her belly, whispering a prayer of gratitude in Hopi to whatever spirits had guided them to this sanctuary. Through the bedroom door, She could hear Cole moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. No hesitation. In his movements, no searching for utensils or ingredients. This was clearly a man comfortable in his own domain. The sounds were oddly comforting, domestic in a way that reminded her of mornings with Kiva, when the simple act of preparing breakfast together had felt like the foundation of happiness. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, Cole was setting 2 plates on a table that looked handmade but crafted with considerable skill. The wood was polished to a warm glow, and the joints were tight enough to speak of someone who took pride in quality work. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Figured you might be hungry after yesterday." The understatement made her smile. Despite herself, hungry didn't begin to describe her condition after weeks of short rations and shorter hope. The plate he set before her held more food than she'd seen in days: eggs from his own chickens, bacon thick-cut and perfectly cooked, biscuits that were still warm from the oven. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," she said. "No trouble. I usually cook for one, but the chickens don't know that. They keep laying eggs whether I need them or not." Cole poured coffee into a cup that matched the others, part of a set rather than the mismatched collection she'd expected from a bachelor. "Rancher. Besides, you're eating for 2. That little warrior needs proper fuel." After breakfast, Cole offered to show her on the property, and Nayeli accepted eagerly. The previous evening's arrival had been too hurried and dim for her to fully appreciate the scope of his operation. In daylight, the Triple T revealed itself as far more than a simple homestead. This was a working ranch that had been planned and built with serious intentions. They started at the barn, a structure that impressed her even more in full light. The building was massive, constructed of heavy timber that would last generations. Stalls lined both sides of a central aisle, each one spacious enough for the largest horse. Above, a hayloft stretched the building's full length, currently well stocked with sweet-smelling grass hay. "You must run a lot of horses," Nayeli observed. "Not as many as I used to," Cole replied, leading her past empty stalls that spoke of recent downsizing. "Had nearly 40 head at one point, but the market's been soft lately. Keeping the best breeding stock and selling off the rest. Quality over quantity." The remaining horses were indeed impressive specimens. Nayeli counted 12 animals, all showing the sturdy build and intelligent eyes that marked them as working stock rather than fancy riding horses. Cole introduced each one by name, speaking to them with the kind of easy familiarity that came from years of partnership. These weren't just livestock to him, they were individuals, each with their own personality and purpose. "That's Sage," he said, indicating a gray mare with kind eyes. "Best cow horse I've ever owned. She can cut a steer out of a herd like she's reading its mind. And this old boy," he rubbed the neck of a scarred gelding, "is Thunder. Saved my life more than once when things got interesting." "Interesting how?" Nayeli asked, intrigued by the stories these animals might tell. Cole's expression grew guarded. "Cattle business attracts all kinds. Not everyone plays by the same rules." Beyond the barn lay a building that puzzled her, smaller than the main structures, but built with the same attention to detail. When Cole led her inside, she found herself in what could only be described as a workshop, but one equipped for purposes she couldn't immediately identify. Workbenches lined the walls, fitted with vices and tools she didn't recognize. In one corner sat a forge, cold now but showing signs of recent use. "What do you make here?" she asked, running her fingers along a workbench worn smooth by years of use. "This and that. Horseshoes when the animals need them. Hardware for the buildings. Sometimes folks bring me things that need fixing." Cole's voice was carefully neutral, but Nayeli sensed deeper currents beneath his casual words. The tools here weren't just for ranch maintenance. Some of them looked like they belonged in a gunsmith's shop. Her attention was caught by something. Hanging on the far wall, a gun belt and holster, both showing the kind of wear that came from serious use. The leather was stained dark with age and handling, and the holster was positioned for a fast draw. This wasn't the equipment of a simple rancher, but of someone who'd lived by violence and needed to be ready for it at any moment. Cole noticed her gaze and moved to block her view of the gun belt, but the damage was done. "Old habits," he said quietly. "Man learns to be prepared for trouble out here. That's more than being prepared," Nayeli said. "That's the gear of someone who went looking for trouble." For a moment, Cole's mask slipped, and she saw something raw and dangerous in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality she was beginning to recognize as his default expression when the conversation turned uncomfortable. "Like I said, old habits. Let's go look at the garden." The subject change was obvious. But Nayeli let it pass. Everyone had secrets, and Cole Travers was clearly a man with more than his share. The important thing was that his current actions suggested someone trying to live peacefully, whatever his past might have contained. The garden was a revelation that temporarily drove thoughts of mysterious pasts from her mind. Vegetables grew in neat rows, tended with obvious care and knowledge. Tomatoes climbed tall stakes, their fruit heavy and red. Corn stood in orderly ranks, the ears fat and promising. Beans and squash completed the traditional trio her grandmother had called the Three Sisters, each plant supporting the others in the ancient way. "You know the old methods," she said, impressed by his understanding of companion planting, learned from a Navajo woman years back. "She taught me that plants, like people, do better when they help each other instead of competing." Cole knelt to check the soil moisture around the tomato plants. "Water's the key to everything out here. Without it, you might as well try farming on the moon." The mention of water reminded Nayeli of the windmill, and Cole was happy to show off what was clearly one of his proudest achievements. The structure stood 30 feet tall, its wheel turning lazily in the morning breeze. Below, a pump worked steadily, drawing water from deep underground and filling a holding tank that supplied the entire ranch. "Spring feeds into an underground stream about 40 feet down," Cole explained. "Water's so pure you can drink it straight from the pump. Never goes dry, even in drought years when other wells fail. That's why I chose this spot for the ranch." The abundance was almost overwhelming to someone who'd spent weeks rationing every drop. Nayeli watched water flowing freely from a tap near the garden, more in a minute than she'd had some entire days. "It must have cost a fortune to have this built," she said. "Did most of the work myself. Took 2 years to get it right, but it was worth every hour. Water's life out here. Everything else, buildings, livestock, crops, they're all secondary to having reliable water." As the day progressed, Cole continued revealing the ranch's many features. A smokehouse for preserving meat. A root cellar that stayed cool even in summer heat. A chicken coop that housed 24 productive hens. Each structure showed the same attention to detail and long-term thinking that characterized everything about the Triple T. But it was the small cemetery that stopped Nayeli in her tracks. Hidden among a grove of cottonwoods behind the main house, 3 wooden crosses marked graves that were obviously well tended. Fresh wildflowers lay at the base of each marker, and the grass was kept short and neat. The largest cross bore a name, carved with obvious care: "Sarah Travers, beloved wife." "I'm sorry," Nayeli said softly. "I didn't know you'd been married." Cole stood silent for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah died in childbirth 6 years ago. The baby didn't make it either. Boy, we were going to name him Matthew." The pain in his voice was so raw that Nayeli felt her own eyes fill with tears. She'd lost her husband, but Cole had lost both wife and child in one terrible blow. The smaller crosses suddenly made sense, twin graves for 2 lives that had barely begun. "The third grave?" she asked gently. "Sarah's sister Emma. She came to help with the birth, caught the fever afterward. Died 3 days later." Cole's jaw worked as he fought for control. "I lost my whole family in a week. Doctor said it was just bad luck, one of those things that happen sometimes. But I knew better. What do you mean? Cole turned away from the graves, his face a mask of controlled fury. The doctor was drunk. Had been for days, but he was the only medical man within 50 miles, so when Sarah went into labor, we sent for him anyway. He showed up reeking of whiskey, hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his instruments. The story poured out of him then, years of suppressed anger and guilt, spilling forth like water from a broken dam. How the drunken doctor had botched the delivery, causing complications that killed both mother and child. How Emma had tried to help, staying to nurse her sister and nephew through their final hours, only to succumb to infection herself. How Cole had been left alone with 3 fresh graves and a rage that threatened to consume him. I wanted to kill him, Cole said simply. The doctor waited outside his office for 3 days with my gun loaded and ready. Would have done it too, if the sheriff hadn't found me first. What stopped you, Sarah? In my mind, I could hear her voice telling me that violence wouldn't bring them back, that revenge would just create more pain. So instead I did something worse. Cole's smile was bitter. I made sure everyone in 3 counties knew exactly what had happened. Made sure that drunken butcher never practiced medicine again. The revelation explained much about Cole's current situation, his isolation, his apparent wealth despite living alone, the defensive features she'd noticed around the ranch. A man who destroyed another man's career, even justifiably, would have made enemies. People who profited from keeping incompetent doctors in business. Wouldn't appreciate someone who exposed their corruption. That's why you live so carefully, Nayeli said. You're still watching for trouble. Some fights never end. They just go quiet for a while. But yes, I've made enemies. People who thought I should have kept my mouth shut and accepted what happened as God's will. They walked back toward the house in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Nayeli found herself seeing Cole Travers with new eyes, not just as a generous stranger, but as a man who'd suffered losses that paralleled her own. He'd lost his family to incompetence and corruption, just as she'd lost Kiva to a system that valued some lives more than others. Is that why you helped me? She asked finally. Because you saw something familiar in my situation. Cole considered the question seriously. Partly, but also because I've learned that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to help the living. Sarah always said I should use my anger for something constructive instead of letting it eat me alive. They'd reached the house's front porch, and Cole gestured toward the rocking chairs that sat there. She used to sit right here in the evenings, talking about the children we'd have, the life we'd build together. After she died, I couldn't bear to look at those chairs. But lately, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Lately I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop living in the past. Nayeli settled into one of the chairs, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby was active today, responding to her emotional state with increased movement. The past has a way of holding on, she said. Even when you want to let it go, maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe we're supposed to carry our losses with us, not as burdens but as reminders of what matters. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Cole's posture changed instantly, his relaxed demeanor replaced by alert tension. His hand moved unconsciously toward where his gun would normally hang, and Nayeli noticed that he positioned himself between her and the approaching rider. Expecting someone, she asked. No, and unexpected visitors usually mean trouble. Cole's voice was grim as he watched a lone horseman crest the ridge overlooking the valley. Stay behind me. If this goes bad, get inside the house and bar the door. The rider descended toward the ranch at an unhurried pace, either very confident or very stupid. As he drew closer, Nayeli could see he was well dressed but armed, a businessman who'd learned to back his negotiations with force. His horse was quality stock, and his saddle bore silver concos that caught the afternoon light. Afternoon. Travers, the man called out as he approached the house. "Nice spread you've got here. Shame if something happened to it." Cole stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun butt. "State your business, Donovan, then get off my land." So this was Donovan. The name carried weight in Cole's voice, suggesting a history between the two men. Nayeli studied the visitor more carefully, noting the calculating eyes and the way he assessed everything he saw, as if appraising its value. "Now that's not very hospitable. I've come with a business proposition that could benefit us both." Donovan's gaze shifted to Nayeli, and something unpleasant flickered in his expression. "I see you've acquired a new employee. Pretty little thing. Half-breed, from the look of her." The casual racism hit Nayeli like a slap, but before she could respond, Cole had moved. In one fluid motion, he'd drawn his pistol and cocked it, the barrel now pointing directly at Donovan's chest. "You'll keep a civil tongue in your head while you're on my property," Cole said, his voice deadly quiet. "Apologize to the lady, then state your business." Donovan raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, but his smirk suggested he wasn't particularly intimidated. "Easy there, Cole. No offense intended. I'm just here to make you an offer. For this place. Very generous offer. Not interested. Never will be. Now get. Don't be hasty. Times are changing. The railroad's coming through, bringing civilization and progress. Places like this, isolated spreads run by stubborn men who don't know when to adapt well. They have a way of becoming dangerous. Accidents happen. Buildings burn. People get hurt." The threat was delivered with a businessman's smile, but the menace beneath was unmistakable. Nayeli felt cold fear settle in her stomach as she realized that Cole's past troubles were about to become present dangers. And now, by association, her problems too. "Get off my land," Cole repeated, his gun never wavering. "And if I see you here again without an invitation, I'll assume you're here to cause trouble and act accordingly." Donovan touched his hat brim in a mocking salute. "Think about it, Travers. Think real hard. Because this offer won't stay open forever, and the alternative might not be so pleasant." He wheeled his horse and rode away at the same leisurely pace, projecting confidence despite having a gun pointed at his back. Cole held his position until the man disappeared over the ridge, then slowly holstered his weapon. "Friend of yours?" Nayeli asked, though the sarcasm felt weak given the circumstances. "Thomas Donovan owns the largest freight company in the territory, plus half the politicians. He's been trying to buy this ranch for years, claims he needs it for a rail depot." Cole's expression was grim. What he really wants is the water rights. Control the water, control everything downstream. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, the confrontation with Donovan cast a shadow over what had been a day of growing understanding. Nayeli found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing not just beauty and abundance but potential vulnerability. The ranch was isolated, far from help if trouble came calling. "Are you having second thoughts?" Cole asked, apparently reading her mind. "Should I be, honestly?" "Probably. Donovan's not the type to give up easily, and having you here," Cole paused, struggling with the implications. "It gives him more leverage. More ways to hurt me." Nayeli placed her hand on her belly, feeling her child move restlessly within her. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, responding with increased activity that was almost painful. "So what are our options?" "Our options?" Cole smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I like the sound of that, even if it's probably not wise. Truth is, running might be the smart choice. I could set you up somewhere safe, somewhere Donovan couldn't find you, and leave you to face him alone. I've been alone for 6 years. I'm used to it." Nayeli turned to face him fully, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe some fights are easier with help. The suggestion hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Naeli felt something shift in her chest, not just gratitude or even friendship, but the beginning of something deeper. Something that might be worth fighting for, if they had the courage. To try, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to face Donovan's threats, and what their growing partnership might mean. But tonight, sitting beside a man who'd shown her kindness when she needed it most, Naeli allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found more than just sanctuary. 3 days passed in deceptive peace after Donovan's visit. Cole went about his daily routine with apparent normalcy, but Naeli noticed the subtle changes, how he checked the horizon more frequently, how his hand never strayed far from his gun, how he insisted she stay close to the house when he rode out to check the cattle. The calm felt fragile, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. On the 4th morning, they discovered the first sign that Donovan wasn't bluffing. Cole's prize bull, a massive Hereford worth more than most men made in a year, lay dead in the north pasture. No obvious cause of death, no wounds or signs of struggle, just a valuable animal that had been alive and healthy the day before, now stiff and cold in the morning sun. Poison, Cole said grimly after examining the carcass. His jaw was tight with controlled fury, and Naeli could see him mentally calculating not just the financial loss, but the escalation in threat level. Probably slipped it to him in some grain. Professional job, whoever did this knew exactly how much to use. Naeli knelt beside the dead animal, her heart aching for the senseless waste. The bull had been a gentle giant, curious about her pregnancy, and often approaching the fence when she passed by. Now he was gone, killed not for any purpose, but to send a message. Will the other cattle be safe? She asked. For now. This was targeted, meant to show they can reach my stock whenever they want. Next time. Cole's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Next time might be worse, might include the horses or even threaten human lives. They buried the bull that afternoon, a grim task that left both of them exhausted and on edge. As they worked, Cole shared more details about his ongoing conflict with Donovan. The freight magnate had been systematically buying up properties throughout the valley, using a combination of generous offers and subtle intimidation to convince owners to sell. Those who refused often found themselves facing mysterious accidents, failed crops, and harassment that made their lives increasingly difficult. Why doesn't the law do something? Naeli asked as they walked back toward the house, both covered in dust and grave dirt. Cole's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Morrison? He's been in Donovan's pocket since the day he took office. Half the town council too. When you control the freight lines, you control the economy. People depend on Donovan for their livelihoods, so they look the other way when he bends the rules. The explanation painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple business rivalry. Donovan had built a network of influence that made him virtually untouchable through legal channels. Anyone who opposed him faced not just his direct retaliation, but the passive hostility of a community that prioritized economic survival over justice. What about the territorial government? They're worse. Governor owes his position to railroad money, and Donovan's positioning himself to be the railroad's partner when they finally push through. As long as he keeps the freight moving and the taxes flowing, they don't care how he runs his business. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but it explained much about Cole's isolation and defensive posture. He wasn't just fighting one man, he was standing against an entire system that had decided his continued resistance was inconvenient. The fact that he'd maintained his independence for this long spoke to a level of courage that bordered on foolhardy. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Naeli made a decision that would change everything. I want to help, she said simply. Cole looked at her sharply. Help how? You're 7 months pregnant and have enough problems of your own without taking on mine. Those problems became mine the moment I accepted your hospitality. Besides, She placed a protective hand on her belly. This child is going to need a safe place to grow up. If Donovan succeeds in driving you out, where does that leave us? The logic was sound, but Cole still looked troubled. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger. You're not asking. I'm offering. Nayeli's voice carried the steel her grandmother had taught her to find in moments of crisis. I may be pregnant, but I'm not helpless. I know things about moving. Unseen, about gathering information, about the kind of help that doesn't require a gun. Her words sparked something in Cole's eyes, not just gratitude, but recognition of her potential value as an ally. He'd been fighting alone for so long that the concept of genuine partnership was almost foreign, but the appeal was obvious. Two people watching for trouble were better than one, and Nayeli's unique perspective might reveal opportunities he'd missed. What did you have in mind? He asked carefully. Nayeli's proposal was elegantly simple. While Cole continued his normal ranching activities, she would establish herself as a harmless presence around the property's edges, a pregnant woman gathering herbs and berries, tending to small tasks that required her to move around the ranch's perimeter. From these positions, she could observe approaches to the property and watch for signs of Donovan's men without appearing to pose any threat. Indian women are invisible to most white men, she explained with bitter humor. They see the pregnancy in the skin color and assume I'm too primitive to understand what's happening around me. That blindness can be turned into an advantage. The plan had merit, but Cole remained hesitant. It's still dangerous. If they realize what you're doing, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now, you need intelligence more than protection. You can't defend against threats you can't see coming. Cole nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. His isolation had been both a strength and a weakness. It kept him safe from direct assault, but left him vulnerable to surprise, attacks and sabotage. Having someone who could provide early warning would significantly improve his tactical position. They spent the rest of the evening planning routes and signals, establishing a communication system that would allow Nayeli to alert Cole to approaching threats without revealing her surveillance role. The work brought them closer together, the shared purpose creating a partnership that went beyond simple host and guest. The opportunity to test their new arrangement came sooner than expected. 2 days later, while Cole was repairing fence in the south pasture, Nayeli spotted movement on the eastern ridge. 3 riders approaching the ranch at a pace that suggested hostile intent rather than casual visitation. She used their agreed-upon signal, hanging a red cloth from the kitchen window, then moved to a concealed position where she could observe without being seen. The riders were Donovan's men, recognizable by their matching horses and professional demeanor. They approached the house boldly, clearly expecting to find Cole alone and vulnerable. When they discovered the building empty, they began a systematic search of the property, looking for signs of recent activity and mapping defensive positions. Nayeli watched from her hiding place among the cottonwoods, memorizing faces and noting equipment. One of the men carried surveying tools, not weapons, but instruments of a different kind of warfare. They were mapping the ranch, preparing for some future action that would require precise knowledge of the terrain and structures. When Cole appeared, drawn by her signal, the confrontation was swift and decisive. 3 against 1 should have favored Donovan's men, but they hadn't expected to face someone who knew they were coming. Cole's tactical advantage, combined with his obvious willingness to use lethal force, convinced the intruders to withdraw. Without achieving their objectives, good work, Cole told her afterward, genuine admiration in his voice. You gave me exactly the kind of warning I needed. They were planning something that required detailed reconnaissance, probably a night raid or sabotage operation. The failed surveillance mission marked a turning point in Donovan's campaign. Subtle intimidation gave way to increasingly direct threats. Over the following week, the ranch suffered a series of accidents that tested both Cole's resolve and their defensive preparations. Fence lines were cut, forcing cattle to stray and requiring exhausting efforts to round them up. The windmill's gearing was sabotaged, temporarily cutting off their water supply until Cole could effect repairs. Each incident was carefully calculated to cause maximum inconvenience without providing grounds for legal action. Donovan was demonstrating his reach while maintaining plausible deniability, showing Cole that resistance would be met with escalating harassment until surrender became the only viable option. But the campaign had an unexpected effect instead of driving a wedge between Cole and Nayeli. The shared adversity strengthened their partnership. They developed routines and contingencies, with Nayeli taking on increasing responsibility for ranch security while Cole focused on offensive preparations. Her pregnancy, far from being a liability, became part of their cover. Who would suspect? "I expectant mother of being a strategic asset. You're enjoying this," Cole observed one evening as they reviewed the day's intelligence reports. Nayeli had identified 2 new surveillance positions being used by Donovan's men and had developed a plan to turn them into traps. "I'm good at it," she replied with satisfaction. "My grandmother used to say that every woman is a warrior. She just needs to find her battlefield. I think I've found mine." As the conflict intensified, Nayeli's pregnancy progressed, adding urgency to their situation. The baby was due within weeks, and the prospect of giving birth during an active siege was sobering. They began making preparations for multiple contingencies, emergency evacuation routes, medical supplies, and communication plans that would work even if the ranch were under direct attack. "Maybe you should go to town for the birth," Cole suggested during one of their planning sessions. "It's safer than trying to handle it here, especially if things get worse." Nayeli shook her head firmly. "Town means the doctor, and the doctor means Donovan knows exactly where I am and when I'm most vulnerable. Besides," she touched her belly protectively, "this child belongs here. This is where it should be born." The decision was partly practical and partly symbolic, a declaration that they weren't going to be driven from their chosen ground by threats and intimidation. But it also reflected a deeper truth about what the ranch had become for both of them. This wasn't just Cole's property anymore, it was their home, worth defending regardless of the cost. The final escalation came in the form of a formal ultimatum delivered by Sheriff Morrison himself. The lawman arrived in his official capacity, accompanied by legal documents that gave Donovan's threats the appearance of governmental authority. The papers claimed that Cole's ranch was being seized for unpaid taxes and that he had 48 hours to vacate the premises. "Those taxes were paid months ago," Cole said after examining the documents. "I've got receipts to prove it." Morrison shrugged apologetically. "Records downtown show different. Course, if you could prove payment was made, that might change things. But the county clerk's office burned down last week. Terrible accident, lost a lot of important documents. The corruption was so blatant it was almost comical, but the threat was real enough." Donovan had finally moved beyond intimidation to open legal theft, using his control of local government to accomplish what violence hadn't achieved. The 48-hour deadline was designed to prevent any effective challenge to the bogus seizure. "What happens if I refuse to leave?" Cole asked. "Then I'll be back with a federal marshal and a writ of eviction. Won't be pleasant for anyone involved, especially not for the lady." Morrison's gaze shifted meaningfully to Nayeli. Shame to see a pregnant woman caught up in unpleasantness that could be avoided. After Morrison left, Cole and Nayeli faced the hardest decision of their partnership. Surrender meant safety, but also the loss of everything they'd built together. Resistance meant risking their lives and the life of her unborn child in a fight against overwhelming odds. "I won't think less of you if we leave," Cole said quietly. "This was my fight before you came here. You don't owe me anything that's worth dying for." Nayeli looked around the kitchen where she'd spent the happiest weeks of her adult life, at the windows that looked out on land she'd come to love, at the man who'd given her hope when she'd had nothing left to lose. "You're wrong," she said finally. This isn't about debt or obligation. This is about choosing what kind of life we want to live. And what kind is that? The kind where we don't let bullies win. The kind where we fight for what matters, even when the odds are bad. The kind where our child grows up knowing that some things are worth standing for. Cole nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. They would make their stand here together, regardless of the consequences. It was a decision born of love rather than logic, but sometimes love was the only compass that pointed toward true north. As night fell over the Triple T Ranch, too, people prepared for a battle that would determine not just their future, but the future of the child who would soon join their world. The odds were against them, but they had something Donovan's money couldn't buy: the courage that came from fighting for home. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Triple T, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but delivered only oppressive heat. Cole stood at the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the ridgelines for signs of movement. The 48-hour deadline had passed 6 hours ago, and Sheriff Morrison's promised return felt imminent. Beside him, Nayeli moved carefully around the kitchen, her pregnancy now so advanced that even simple tasks required deliberate effort. "Riders coming," she said quietly, not looking up from the medical supplies she was organizing. Her voice carried no surprise. They'd both known this moment would come. The only question had been when and in what numbers. Cole counted 8 men cresting the eastern ridge, more than he'd expected, but fewer than Donovan could have fielded if he'd wanted to overwhelm them completely. The restraint suggested this was still being treated as a legal proceeding rather than an all-out assault. Morrison rode in front, his badge glinting in the pale morning light, while Donovan himself brought up the rear on his expensive stallion. "He came personally," Nayeli observed, following Cole's gaze. "That means he's either very confident or very desperate, both probably. He's invested too much in this campaign to let someone else finish it." Cole checked his rifle one final time, then moved toward the door. "Remember what we discussed. If this goes bad, you get to the root cellar and stay there until it's over." Nayeli's laugh was sharp with tension. "We've been through this. I'm not hiding while you face them alone. Besides," she patted the pistol tucked into her apron, "I can still shoot straight. Even like this." The confrontation began with all the formality of legitimate law enforcement. Morrison dismounted at the prescribed distance and approached the house with official documents in hand, every gesture calculated to suggest legal authority rather than criminal extortion. But the men flanking him told a different story: hired guns rather than deputies, their weapons loose in their holsters and their eyes scanning for tactical advantages. "Cole Travers," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the reluctant authority of a man who knew he was in the wrong but couldn't afford to back down. "By order of the territorial court, you are hereby commanded to vacate these premises immediately. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal." Cole stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Show me the warrant, Morrison. Show me the legal documentation that gives you the right to steal a man's property, right here." Morrison held up the papers, but kept his distance. "All signed and sealed proper. You want to examine them, you can do it from the county courthouse." After you vacated, the legal fiction was paper thin, but it provided Donovan with the cover he needed. As long as Morrison maintained the pretense of official action, any resistance could be painted as lawlessness rather than self-defense. It was a brilliant strategy that used the forms of justice to commit injustice. "I'm not leaving," Cole said simply. "This is my land, bought and paid for, and I'll defend it against any man who tries to take it illegally." That's when Donovan himself rode forward, abandoning the pretense of letting Morrison handle the situation. His expensive suit and polished boots looked out of place in the ranch yard, but his presence transformed the confrontation from legal proceeding to personal vendetta. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Travers," Donovan said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. I've offered you fair compensation for this property. More than fair, considering its isolated location and limited prospects. Limited prospects. Cole's voice dripped with contempt. You mean limited until the railroad comes through and turns this valley into the most valuable freight depot in the territory. Limited until the water rights become worth more than all the gold in California. Donovan's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating mind beneath the civilized exterior. Water rights can be complicated things, especially for men who don't have the resources to defend their claims in court. Expensive business fighting the railroad in federal court. The threat was clear. Even if Cole somehow survived this immediate confrontation, he'd face years of legal battles against opponents with unlimited resources and political connections. It was a war of attrition he couldn't possibly win, and Donovan knew it. But I'm a reasonable man, Donovan continued. I'm prepared to make you one final offer. Take my money, relocate somewhere safer, and we'll forget this unpleasantness ever happened. Refuse, and I'm afraid I can't be responsible for what might occur during the legal proceedings. Before Cole could respond, Nayeli appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful dignity of a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy. Her presence changed the dynamic instantly. What had been a confrontation between armed men became something more complex, more morally ambiguous. Attacking the pregnant woman, even indirectly, would cross lines that even Donovan's hired guns might hesitate to breach. Mr. Donovan, she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through months of hardship. I couldn't help but overhear your generous offer. But I'm curious about something. Why do you want this particular property so badly? Surely a man of your resources could find other suitable locations for his business ventures. The question was innocent enough on its surface, but it forced Donovan to reveal more than he'd intended. Water is the key to everything in this territory, my dear. Control the water, and you control development. This ranch sits on the largest reliable spring for 50 miles in any direction. So it's not really about the railroad at all, Nayeli continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling around them. It's about cornering the water market. About forcing every rancher, every farmer, every town in the valley to come to you when they need the most basic necessity of life. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he realized she'd maneuvered him into admitting his true motives. The legal fiction about unpaid taxes and railroad development suddenly looked like what it was, a cover story for monopolistic land grabbing. You're very perceptive for a woman in your condition. Being pregnant doesn't make me stupid, Mr. Donovan. Just more protective of what matters. Nayeli's hand moved to rest on her belly, the gesture both maternal and defiant. This child will need clean water to drink, good land to grow up on, and the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for. The confrontation might have continued as a battle of words and wills, but violence has its own logic, independent of human intention. One of Donovan's hired guns, a nervous man with quick hands and poor judgment, saw Cole shift his grip on his rifle and interpreted the movement as aggressive. His own weapon cleared leather in a smooth draw that spoke of professional competence. Cole's response was instantaneous and lethal. The crack of his rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and the gunman toppled from his saddle before his pistol fully cleared its holster. The precision of the shot center mass at 40 yards sent a clear message about Cole's own professional capabilities. The death of his gunman galvanized Donovan's remaining men into action. What had been a tense standoff exploded into chaos. As weapons appeared and lead began flying, Cole dove for cover behind a water trough, his rifle working with mechanical precision as he engaged multiple targets. Nayeli, despite her condition, proved far from helpless. Her pistol barked twice, and 2 more attackers went down. The initial exchange left 3 of Donovan's men dead, and the others seeking cover wherever they could find it. Morrison, his legal authority evaporating in gunsmoke, crouched behind his horse and tried to restore some semblance of order. But the situation had moved beyond law and into the realm of survival. "This is insane," Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "Stand down, all of you." This was supposed to be a legal proceeding. "Tell that to the men shooting at us," Cole replied, levering another round into his rifle's chamber. His position behind the water trough gave him good cover and excellent fields of fire, but it also pinned him in place. If Donovan's men could get around his flanks, his tactical advantage would evaporate. Nayeli had taken position inside the house, using the windows to provide supporting fire while maintaining better protection. Her condition limited her mobility, but her shooting remained accurate. Each shot was carefully aimed, and none were wasted. The baby inside her seemed to sense the danger, moving restlessly as adrenaline flooded her system. As the gunfight stalemated, Donovan made a decision that revealed the true depths of his character. Rather than retreat and regroup, he ordered his remaining men to burn the ranch buildings. If he couldn't take the property intact, he'd ensure it was worthless to anyone else. "Torch the barn," he commanded, his civilized mask finally dropping. "Completely. Burn it all. I want nothing left standing." The sight of flames licking at his barn's weathered timbers pushed Cole beyond rational calculation. This wasn't just property being destroyed, it was 15 years of his life, the monument to everything he'd built from nothing. He broke from cover in a desperate attempt to save what he could, exposing himself to enemy fire in the process. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. Blood soaked through his shirt as he struggled to maintain his grip on the rifle. From the house, Nayeli's scream of anguish cut through the chaos like a blade. Seeing Cole wounded transformed Nayeli from defensive fighter to avenging fury. Her earlier restraint evaporated as maternal protective instincts for Cole as much as for her unborn child took complete control. She emerged from the house like a force of nature, her pistol speaking with deadly authority as she advanced. On Donovan's position, "You want this land," she shouted, her voice carrying across the battlefield with startling clarity. "Come and take it from a pregnant woman, you coward." Her challenge had a galvanizing effect on the remaining gunmen. The idea of shooting a heavily pregnant woman, even in self-defense, violated codes that transcended professional loyalty. One by one, they began backing away from the fight, their weapons lowering despite Donovan's furious commands. "Stand and fight," Donovan raged at his retreating men. "She's just one woman. She's a pregnant woman defending her home." One of the gunmen replied, holstering his weapon. "That's not what I signed up for, Mr. Donovan. Find yourself another army." The stress and violence of the siege had taken its toll on Nayeli's body in ways she'd tried to ignore. As the gunfire finally died away and Donovan's remaining forces retreated, she felt the first unmistakable contraction grip her abdomen like an iron fist. The baby, 2 weeks early but determined to make its entrance, had chosen this moment of chaos to begin its journey into the world. "Cole," she gasped, pain and fear warring in her voice. "The baby's coming." Cole struggled to his feet despite his wounded shoulder, his face pale with blood loss, but his eyes immediately focusing on her needs rather than his own injury. "How long between contractions?" "They just started, but they're strong." Another wave of pain doubled her over, more intense than anything she'd experienced before. "Something's wrong. This is happening too fast." The medical supplies they'd carefully prepared were scattered around the kitchen, disrupted by the gunfight. Cole began gathering what he could with his good arm while trying to staunch the bleeding from his shoulder wound. Outside, smoke from the burning barn cast everything in hellish orange light, as if responding to some cosmic sense of irony. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain began falling in torrents, helping to control the barn fire but turning the ranch yard into a muddy quagmire. The sound of water hammering on the roof mixed with Nayeli's increasingly urgent breathing as her labor accelerated beyond normal bounds. Something's definitely wrong, she panted between contractions. The baby's in distress. I can feel it, Coles. Medical knowledge was limited to battlefield treatment of wounds, but he'd assisted with enough animal births to recognize the signs of a complicated delivery. The baby was indeed coming too fast, and Nayeli's obvious distress suggested complications that were beyond his ability to handle. We need help, he said, though they both knew help was hours away, even under ideal conditions. I could try. To ride for the doctor, no. Nayeli's voice was firm despite her pain. You're wounded, and I won't let you die trying to save us. Besides, that drunken butcher wouldn't come out here even if you could reach him. We do this ourselves or not at all. Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented violence. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks that illuminated the chaos of the ranch's scattered equipment, wounded horses, and the smoldering remains of buildings that represented a lifetime of work. The wind howled like a living thing, driving rain through every crack and crevice in the house. But inside, in the bedroom where Cole had once planned to raise children with his first wife, a different kind of struggle was taking place. Nayeli fought through labor complicated by stress, exhaustion, and her body's traumatic response to the day's violence. Each contraction was a battle. Each breath of victory wrested from circumstances that seemed determined to defeat her. Cole did what he could with his limited knowledge and wounded condition. He boiled water, prepared clean cloths, and offered what comfort and encouragement he could manage. But both of them knew they were facing a crisis that would test everything they'd learned about survival and determination. Tell me about the ranch, Nayeli gasped during a brief respite between contractions. Tell me about what we'll build. Here when this is over. Cole understood what she was doing, focusing on the future rather than the present crisis, using hope as an anchor against despair. We'll rebuild the barn first, he said, his voice steady despite his own pain. Bigger than before, with proper stalls for the horses you'll want to raise. What makes you think I want to raise horses? She managed to ask. Because you have the touch for it. I've seen how the animals respond to you. They trust you, the way they trust me. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and Cole knew they were approaching the moment of truth. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the valley, but inside, two people prepared to welcome new life into Co. A world that had just proven how dangerous and unpredictable it could be. The baby would be born into chaos, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the uncertainty of an unknown future. But it would also be born into love, protected by two people who'd found in each other the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thunder crashed overhead as Nayeli bore down with a primal scream that seemed to shake the cabin's foundations. Cole knelt beside the bed, his wounded shoulder forgotten, hands steady despite everything they'd endured. The storm outside raged with biblical fury, but inside this room, life was fighting its way into existence with stubborn determination. I can see the head, Cole said, his voice filled with wonder and terror. One more push, Nayeli. Just one more. She gathered every ounce of remaining strength, drawing on reserves she didn't know existed. The pain was beyond description, but so was the fierce joy that accompanied it. This child had been conceived in love, carried through hardship, and now would be born in chaos, a warrior from the very beginning. With a final, earth-shaking cry, the baby slipped into the world. Cole caught the tiny form with trembling hands. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the child lay silent and still, and both parents felt their hearts stop. Then came the sound they'd been praying for, a thin, angry wail that announced this new soul had arrived ready to fight. Cole cleared the baby's airway with gentle fingers, and the crying grew stronger. More indignant. It's a girl, Cole whispered, his voice breaking. A beautiful, perfect little girl. Nayeli reached out with trembling arms to receive her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she looked into eyes that were already alert and aware. The baby had dark hair like her mother and skin that spoke of her mixed heritage. She would grow up belonging to two worlds. "Hello, little warrior," Nayeli whispered in Hopi. "Welcome to the world. I'm sorry it's such a complicated place. But your mama and daddy will help you figure it out." Cole felt his heart constrict at the word, daddy. He hadn't dared to hope for it, but hearing it made him realize how much this moment meant. This child wasn't his by blood, but she was his by choice, by love, by bonds forged in hardship and sealed in hope. As if nature itself had been waiting for the birth to conclude, the storm began to subside. Thunder moved off toward the eastern. Mountains and driving rain gentled to a steady patter. Through the window, tentative sunlight broke through clouds, painting everything in gold and promise. The sound of approaching horses the next morning drew Cole's attention. 3 men in federal marshal badges rode into the ranch yard, their intentions clearly official rather than hostile. "You Cole Travers?" the lead marshal asked. "Name's Hendricks. We've been investigating reports of corruption in the Territorial Land Office. Got word there was trouble out here involving fraudulent tax seizures. Who reported it? Sheriff Morrison, believe it or not. Seems he developed a conscience after watching 3 men die over forged documents. He's in federal custody, telling U.S. everything about Thomas Donovan's operations." Marshal Hendricks spent an hour documenting the scene and taking Cole's statement. The presence of federal authority transformed everything. What had been a desperate fight for survival became a legitimate case of self-defense against criminal conspiracy. "Donovan's finished," Hendricks said as he prepared to leave. "Even if criminal charges don't stick, his political connections are worthless now. Nobody wants to associate with a man who burns ranches and threatens pregnant women." The weeks that followed were a time of healing and reconstruction. Cole's shoulder wound mended cleanly, and the ranch began recovering from the damage. Neighbors arrived unexpectedly to help with rebuilding. "Never did like that Donovan," explained Sam Patterson, arriving with a wagon full of lumber. "Figure a man who'd stand up to him deserves some support." Others followed Patterson's lead, creating a barn raising that became a celebration of community and resistance to corruption. Men who'd been afraid to oppose Donovan openly found courage in Cole's example. Nayeli discovered the joys and challenges of new motherhood. The baby, whom they'd named Hope Sarah Travers, honoring both the future and Cole's first wife, proved as strong-willed as her dramatic birth suggested. She nursed eagerly, slept soundly, and regarded the world with alert eyes. One evening, as they sat on the rebuilt porch watching sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Cole finally voiced the question growing in his heart. Hope slept peacefully in Nayeli's arms. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting," Cole began, his confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty. "And I know we've been through hell together. But I need to say something before I lose my nerve. I love you," Cole said simply. "I love you and I love Hope, and I want us to be a real family. Not just people sharing a house because of circumstances, but a family by choice. By commitment. By the kind of love that lasts through anything." He pulled a ring from his pocket, not an expensive store-bought bauble, but a band he'd crafted himself, carved from silver and set with a small turquoise stone that matched her eyes. Nayeli silenced him by leaning forward and kissing him gently, the baby cradled safely between them. When they separated, her eyes were bright with tears and laughter. "Cole Travers," she said, "you saved my life when I had nothing left to lose. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what it felt like. You fought beside me when other men would have run, and you delivered our daughter when no one else could help." She held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling care. It fit perfectly, as if made for her specifically, which it had been. "Besides," she added with a smile containing worlds of mischief and promise, "I happen to like complicated men. The simple ones are boring." They were married a month later under the cottonwoods where Cole's first family lay buried. Sarah's grave was decorated with fresh wildflowers, a gesture of respect and inclusion that spoke to the kind of woman Nayeli was. Federal Marshal Hendricks performed the ceremony, and the guest list included neighbors, traveling merchants, and even former enemies who'd come to respect Cole's integrity. Hope Sarah Travers, now 6 weeks old, slept peacefully through the ceremony until the moment they were pronounced husband and wife. Then she woke with a lusty cry that seemed to offer her own commentary, drawing laughter from the assembled crowd. 1 year later, the Triple T Ranch had not just recovered, it had flourished. The story of the siege had attracted honest settlers who wanted to build lives where integrity mattered more than connections. The valley was filling with families who shared their values. Hope was walking now, toddling around with fearless confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. She had her mother's dark eyes and determined chin, combined with Cole's quiet intensity. Watching her explore with boundless curiosity, both parents knew they'd given her something precious, a place where she belonged completely. On summer evenings, when work was done and desert air was soft with cooling temperatures, the three of them would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over land that had tested them, threatened them, and ultimately embraced them. Hope would babble commentary on the day's events while her parents held hands and planned for a future that seemed as endless and promising as the Arizona sky. The well that Nayeli had tried so desperately to dig by hand remained unfinished, now just a depression that filled with wildflowers each spring. But the deeper well she'd found, the one connecting her to Cole, to the land, and to a future worth fighting for, continued to sustain them all. Some water came from underground springs, but the most important kind flowed from connections between people who chose to make their stand together.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.